Welcome to the November edition of Mytech U, a monthly educational series for technology and business topics. My name is Nathan Austin, and I will be your moderator today. This month, we'll be holding a panel discussion on the topic of how and why redundancy and recovery. We're fortunate to have three panelists with us today who will share their individual stories and experience on today's topic. But before we turn the presentation over to our panel and they introduce themselves, I'd like to thank you, for all of us attending and for listening online and who are listening now as well as in the future. Thanks for joining us and for listening. This presentation is being recorded and will be available online within 24 hours. And just so everyone knows, the audience is on mute. However, if you have a question, please use the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll make sure to interject the question into the conversation, or if we're not able to, we'll follow up with you afterwards. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed panel. And starting with Joe, would you mind please introduce yourself? And that'll kick off the discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nate. Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Kuter. I am the IT manager at Intrex Aerospace. We are in Colorado, Thornton, Colorado, just north of Denver. And we are an aerospace and defense manufacturer. We make a lot of little tiny parts, nothing too exciting, nothing that you could see or know if you were looking at it, maybe even what it does. I have been in the IT industry for about 10, 12 years, something like that at this point. I started my career in managed service provider role, worked through a couple companies there, and then ended up at Intrex about a year and a half ago. And it's been a wild ride, we'll just say that. There are a lot of experiences and things that I tend to draw on from my managed service provider days and try to implement a lot of those things here at Intrex, best practices, things I've seen along the way. And thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Joe. On to you, Robert. Could you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Jacoby. I'm IT manager for Pohlad Companies. Pohlad Companies is we're based downtown Minneapolis. It's a family office holding company. For those that are familiar with the name in the Twin Cities area, they're probably best known for owning the Minnesota Twins baseball club. And so I work for the corporate office. Been with the organization about 17 years now, in different roles and with different companies within the family of companies. And I think that should do for an introduction for right now.
All right, thanks, Robert. Joel, can you tell us about yourself?
Yes, my name is Joel Swanson, and my career was in IT, and I have been out of IT for 5 years or so, moved more in the direction of operations management and process design kinds of things. And then 4 years ago, I started my own company doing EOS. So EOS is a system for helping small to mid-sized companies grow and scale, so aligning everybody around a common vision and teaching people how to execute so they can achieve that vision, and then building healthy teams at all levels of the organization. So also referred to as traction. You might have heard traction in the marketplace. So that's what I do. I still speak technology, but I have not been directly involved in technology for somewhere between 5 and 10 years.
All right, thanks, Joel. So with that said, for everyone, the objective and the hope today is that, and to plant some seeds for you to think about questions to ask in the audience, is that these gentlemen have years and years, decades of experience between the three of them, and they've seen a lot, they've been through a lot, and I'm hoping that in any goal we have when we share like on a Mytech U session like this, is that if we can learn from each other, hopefully we all don't have to experience the same things in order to be able to mitigate whatever risk or whatever problem we're trying to solve. So with that said, I'm going to start this off hopefully with kind of a bang. I was thinking about saving this to the end, but I think to start the conversation, and I don't know who would like to go first, but like, let's start with each one of you telling a story of the most memorable, I'll say outage, failure, just disruptive experience you can remember that was related to technology from your past. Whatever that might have been. So, I don't know.
This is Joel. I can go.
Let's go.
All right,
go ahead,
Joe.
Joel.
Let's go.
All right, so my probably most memorable was fairly soon after I started here at Intrex. We have a server infrastructure that has multiple servers and storage and things like that. And when I came in, there was a service provider that had been working with Intrex, and I had been told on many occasions that everything was built correctly and everything was up and running, and it would take an act of God to bring everything down. Well, fast forward about 2 months into my new position here, and we had a hardware failure on one of the servers. It was a network card, something fairly innocuous, something that shouldn't have caused the problem that it did. And by the time we figured out what was going on and were able to kind of work around the problem, we were 4 hours down, and in a machine shop, 4 hours is fairly expensive. So after a lot of stress and dealing with everything that was going on with that, needless to say, I wanted to take another look and see how our environment was built, what was going on, and don't just take the word of a company that I had never met before. And by the way, which was not Mytech. Just want to make sure that was fully clear here.
Thank you, Joe.
Which was part of the reason why we went to the Mytech. And just seeing what could go wrong and knowing that there are technologies that exist and things that have been around for years and years, knowing that we can keep everything up and running while still losing some of our systems. So
Joe, just as a follow-up on that, so you said that's what the network card is, what kind of caused the problem. How did you get back up and operational? And was there an interim state, it sounds like, before you got the final fix, or how, what did you end up doing to resolve that?
Yeah. So the interim fix was these network cards on the servers. They have multiple ports on them. So I was able to shift some things around in our virtual environment to bring all the servers back up. The final fix for this was to actually have duplicate network cards built into these servers and fully redundant network connections. So I think at this point we can lose, there's 8 total, so we can lose 3 or 4, I think, and still be fully functional in the environment.
So I heard, and one of the things I always like to extract is the key lessons learned. I heard a couple of them. I just want to repeat them. One is that do your due diligence, right? So don't trust but verify, right? Is I think way to maybe summarize what you were saying.
Absolutely.
And then also just you found that there's a inexpensive. I mean, network cards aren't that expensive, so I mean you were able to just build some redundancy at that level. Is there anything else, other key lessons learned from that experience?
I think the last thing is don't necessarily take somebody else's word for it. Plan for contingencies. Know that something is going to go wrong. We had a guy I used to work with said that there's 2 types of people in this world: those who have lost data and those who will lose data. So know that something bad will happen eventually, and just try to plan your contingencies around that.
Very good. That's good. Thanks for sharing that. So Joel, I know you've got a story, so I'll go over to you, and that Robert, I'll just make sure you've got a little more time to think about yours. So Joel, do you want to share yours? The most memorable experience you've had.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm ready to actually talk about this publicly. I might choke up here, so bear with me. That was a joke, but this was a big thing. So when Joe was talking, he said something about the network card died and it shouldn't have caused an issue. And the thing that I have learned in my career is that when disasters happen, it's usually a combination of at least 3 different things that should never have happened, but did somehow. So for Joe, it was the network card shouldn't have died. I shouldn't have relied on this company without verifying what they did. And when the network card did die, it shouldn't have failed to roll over to another network card. Well, in the situation that I lived through, there's actually 5 things that should never have happened. So the short version of the story is that this is when I was in IT, so one of my clients lost their entire customer database. And the database shouldn't have had a problem. That was thing number 1. Thing number 2, when the database did have a problem, the database admin should never have called on the phone and walked an admin through how to fix it. And even if that happened, the admin should never have guessed and should never have done anything other than do exactly what the database admin told them to do, but they did. And the backup system should not have ever had an issue, but it did. And then number 5 is I was responsible for overseeing this entire system and making sure that it was working. And I was negligent in that and hadn't been vigilant. And the admin on the phone with the database administrator overwrote their entire customer database. And this is a company of 60, 70 people. They were a school of, not a school as in like day school, but they did a lot of athletic things for students, and they did it all in quarters. And they had just completed registration for their winter quarter, and they'd registered 2,500, 3,000 students, and all of that was just gone. And it was my fault. And so they had just gotten a $16 million loan for expansion, and then they lost everything. And and I was in my early to mid 20s. I didn't understand business law. And so I'm thinking, well, A, they're going out of business. B, I'm going to get fired. C, I'm going to get sued personally. And I'm 24 years old and my career is over before before it even ever started. And so I will never forget, somewhere around midnight, laying on the floor in the server room, covered up with my coat, using my stocking cap as a pillow, waiting for a call back from a disaster recovery company, seeing if they can help me out. It was 3 days before Christmas, and I'm thinking I'm just done. And not only am I done, but this company that employs 60 or 70 people is just, they have no data, and they're going to go out of business. There's no way that a company can sustain a loss like that and keep going. So that was a big event, not just in my career, but in my life, honestly, and has taught me a lot about the way that I relate to my clients and the way that I relate to issues of different magnitude. So not a fun thing to live through.
So that's definitely, I can see why that's a memorable experience, especially at the beginning of your career, that you thought it was going to be a career-ending move. But so what happened? So what were you able to? Were you able to recover anything?
So yeah. So most of the time when these things happen, there is not a good end to the story. In this case, there was a good end to it. And the same way when a disaster happens, there's a combination of things that should never have happened that did. In recovering from this, there was a couple things that were very lucky that allowed us to pull through this. So thing number 1 is that the very next quarter, this school was going to go to an online registration system. This was the very last quarter that they had used paper. And so they still had boxes and boxes and boxes of paper registration forms. And then the other thing that happened that was unexpected was I found a backup. I found one backup that was about 6 weeks old. And when I tell this story, I call it the God backup, because it was a backup that was in a location I never would have put it. And it was named something I never would have called it. And to this day, I have no idea how that backup got there. But we were able to restore from about 6 weeks old. And fortunately, because they were still on paper, very little had changed in their database in the last 6 weeks, prior to, these 3,000 students registering. And so over Christmas break, we hired a bunch of temps and got the temps in and set them in front of computers and paid them to re-enter all of this data. And so there was an interruption of a handful of days for them in terms of not being able to access their data, but the company weathered the storm and was through it just fine. But like I said, these kinds of stories rarely have those happy endings.
Yeah. So what would you say are the summarize some of the key lessons learned that you had that you've kind of taken with you in your career from that event?
Well, the biggest thing is always make sure the backup is working, obviously, from a technical standpoint. And even with my current clients, I'm not in IT anymore, but even with my current clients that are EOS clients, every once in a while I'll hear something from them related to data redundancy or backup, and I hold the show here. Let's we're going to stop what we're doing here, and we need to make sure that you are addressing this, because if you don't, the consequences can be astronomical. And then the other big thing that I learned just as a business person is that my job is to do what my clients need me to do, not what they want me to do necessarily. And at age 24, I was busy running around making sure that all the users were happy and they could access their printers and things like that. And I was negligent of what they really needed, which was to be sure their backup was working. And I don't do that anymore. When I'm talking to my clients, I tell them, you know, I don't work with people I don't like, and hopefully we can all be friends and go out for a beer together. But at the end of the day, I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to help you become great. And sometimes that means not doing what you want. And if I would have known that and understood that back then, it would have been a very different scenario.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Joel. That last one in particular, I know that's something that is a tough balance to have as far as you know, holding a line, because in the end, this is a lesson that I know Mytech has learned through. Well, it took us a while to learn. We're sometimes slow a little bit, right? But it took us a while to learn it sometimes. But really holding a line and saying, look, you're going to hold me accountable to this, regardless of you telling me right now you're going to hold me accountable to this. So I better make sure this is taken care of, right? So because in the end, your expectation, I know your expectation is that you want to hold me accountable to this. And so let's make sure that the pieces are in place so that I feel comfortable assuming that responsibility and that risk. So that's very good. All right, Robert, to you, sir. Tell us your most memorable experience relative to some outage or disaster that happened.
Yeah, and I think my story kind of relates a little closer to Joe's when it comes to good old vendor management is the key. Our phone system was managed and co-located at a different location from where we're at, and we had the phone system go down, and it was down for about 48 hours. So we had no calls in or out of our office, and of all my years, you know, the phones have worked for people for hundreds of years now, and so their forgiveness factor is not there. Phones have always worked. They pick them up, they work, and so believe me, that was one where there was no forgive on that. And so, like I said, we were down for, I think it was about 48 hours without voice.
So what happened in that situation, and what ended up getting you back up and running?
Well, it was the environment that it was hosted on was I'm not trying to remember the details. I think it was a Cisco physical server environment, and it was running a virtual server on top of that. And it was an issue with the software not properly working, and they did an update somewhere in that process, and that's what kind of threw everything out of loop. So in that case, I wasn't so much worried about data being backed up as I was just the functionality and business continuity of the systems.
Yeah. So So how did you how did you recover, and what are some of the lessons you learned from that recovery? Like you said, you weren't worried about the backup per se, the data backup per se, but what brought you back online?
Well, they finally figured it out and got it. And I don't remember the exact fix, but the longer term, we're no longer with that company. And so part of our process when we moved to a different provider, which is truly a cloud provider for voice, was we focused on, you know, vendor management up front. You know, the original company was, yeah, we kind of do this. We can do it for you guys. You know, it wasn't their core business, which is a plug for Mytech, is you guys stick with your core and you do awesome at it. You don't try to, yeah, we got somebody that can maybe do that for you. And so when we looked for a replacement, we looked for somebody that was their business. That's all they did was voice. And then redundancy. We built more redundancy, and knowing that it was going to be a true internet-based phone system, you know, this went to help with that outage, but now we've got redundant internet lines into our building. We really focus more on the business continuity piece than we do the disaster recovery piece. And that's kind of been just a shift with the cloud in general.
No, that makes sense. That's great. I think that I appreciate you mentioning. I didn't know you were going to mention this, by the way, but the vendor management piece, because and not just for mentioning Mytech there, but I think that's a very often missed piece, and I think sometimes understanding what, like, as a customer, as a client, I think it's also important for you to understand, as you mentioned, the core competency of your vendor, right? And that know that if either they're assuming a risk or you're assuming the risk, like you mentioned, where if it's stretching them, that's one thing, but is that what you want to build your business on, right? Some critical functionality.
Yeah, and business, or the whole vendor management's become big for us, because in our current IT environment, it's me and one desktop support person for the corporate office, which is about 80 users. And we made the conscious effort when we started this 4 years ago, was, do I want to go out and hire a network admin, server admin, SQL guy, and all this, or do we want to rely on good vendors that can bring that expertise in house? And so the phone system predated that discussion. So I think I can hopefully naively say, if we redid it, we would have selected a different vendor in the first place, but can't rewrite history. So going forward, that's always been a process in our heads. My head, when I do that, is how do they react to situations like this, and what's going to get me into that, that same trouble that I was stuck when the phone system went down.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. So that's actually a great segue question that I was going to ask relative to, and Robert, that it came from our conversation that we had, because I wasn't even thinking about asking this question, but from redundancy of personnel, right? You talked about it. It's been an intentional strategy as far as making a decision. Do we want to hire all these individual experts, or do we want to partner with someone who has those core competencies? And how is that? Can you, and Robert, I'll just continue with you down this line of thinking, but Joe and Joel, please think about this, because I'd like to go to you next, is from a redundancy of personnel, and kind of that, in that regard, business continuity of personnel, how has that affected your decisions that you've made in like choosing vendors or having this strategy as part of your organization?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, go back to that voice discussion. When we started looking at a replacement for the phones, where to host it, we weren't looking for, two guys that could work on it. We wanted a company that had some background and had redundancy within their organization. And that's the same way with our desktop support here. We've got one person, him and I have worked together, I think 11 years now. I think I originally hired him. And so we're a good fit, but it's always trying to figure out what happens if he wins the lottery and leaves. And so that's always been an important thing for us, on that continuity of people, of even like when Mytech comes and sits here when my guy is out on vacation, we always make a conscious effort to have the same person coming in, and if that person's been promoted within Mytech, of keeping that, a primary and a secondary, and we kind of keep that across the board on anything we do. Is I need to know who the backup is for the guy that's doing this work. If he gets hit by a bus, who's his backup? And so the business continuity has been as big on the people as it is the technology when we're reviewing this. Does that answer your question, Nate?
No, it does. And we prefer, especially when we're talking to IT people and have this conversation, we prefer to say, win the lottery as opposed to hit by the bus. It usually goes over a little bit better with the IT personnel that we're talking to. But yes, actually, as Joe, I'm going to go to you next, but I'll give you another second to think. One of our customers, and this was, it's been over a decade now, but the IT person for that it was a large nonprofit here in the Twin Cities, actually got hit by a car walking across the street coming back from lunch one day. He actually was fine. It was very minor, not a big deal. He didn't even have to go to the hospital. But that scared the executive team of that organization because all the information was in his head. So, I mean, the hit by a bus thing that you mentioned, it wasn't that bad, but it definitely that happens, and it's something it's another piece to think about from a partnership perspective and vendor management, since you brought that up. So, with that said, Joe, how does Intrex, and it doesn't have to be just relative to IT either, by the way, but how do you consider, from a redundancy from a personnel perspective?
Yeah, so from a personnel perspective, non-IT, I'll say Intrex has had some things happen over the last year. We've basically went from 55 employees at the beginning of 16. At the beginning of 17, we're up to 97 to 100, somewhere in that range. So we've obviously had to bring a lot of staff in, a lot of new machinists, operators, things like that. And we've found that a lot of people in this, in businesses our size, end up getting cross-trained to do multiple things. So, for example, if our customer service rep who enters in sales order, if she's out, well, we've got 2 or 3 other people that can kind of fill that gap. Purchase orders, purchasing, AP, AR, all of that stuff. There's always multiple people that can handle those different roles. Now, from a more personal side, I'm generally a person that's more interested in quality of life than somebody that's going to be sitting in my office for 60, 70 hours a week. So having that backup to actually take vacations and be with my family is great. And we have been working with Mytech, so when I'm going to be out of the office, Mytech can just step right in and take any calls, anything that comes up, and there's generally no hiccups or anything like that. They just kind of pick right up and go.
Yeah, Joe, in our industry, I know I've talked to other IT professionals where they sometimes the stress and the anxiety of their role, because they don't feel like they can take a vacation, and they're going out fishing, and they get a support call, and they literally have to put down their fishing pole and try and remote in from their cell phone in the middle of a lake to try and do support. So yeah, I appreciate that's been part of the consideration for both.
Absolutely. And one other piece that we're just kind of adding on now is we've had a lot of projects come over recently, and unfortunately my time is getting more and more dedicated to those projects, and a lot of the day-to-day kind of end user type of stuff is getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. So what we're working with Mytech now is how do we increase our service levels so that the end users still get the support they need, but I still have the time to work and move the projects forward that we're working on. And I think we have a pretty good solution on that. So just being able to engage a little bit more with Mytech and free myself up to work on some of this other high level stuff. Well,
and that's a good segue, I think, to Joel, is that really, our goal with working, this wasn't to be about this necessarily, but we since you brought it up, we definitely want you to work on the highest value and best use of your time, right? And if we can help offload some of the easier stuff that you can focus on the higher value stuff, then that's great. So that's awesome to hear. So Joel, I'm sure that's part of how you engage your clients relative to focusing on the highest value and use of their time. So I don't know, can you tell us about any stories you have to share around this topic?
Well, I don't have any glorious stories to share, so I'll save time for other things, but I do want to share a quote, and I think this is Dan Sullivan that he said, outsource everything but genius. And that's a philosophy that I use in my own business, and so I could expound on that, but I just wanted to share that as kind of a summary to what these people are saying, and then I'll let us move on to different things.
Good. Well, that's thanks, Joel. And actually, I was just at a conference this last week, and one of the speakers mentioned, he said something along those lines. He said, "If it's not my genius, it's not my job." And he wasn't saying that in the context of to say it's not my job and not do things, but saying really to focus on what you're really great at.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's great. So the next thing I'd like to ask for all of you is, cloud hosted services is obviously it's been around. I mean, it's evolved from application service providers to software as a service, hardware as a service, infrastructure as a service, all these different as a service models. But let's just lump that all together into either cloud or hosting for everyone listening. So relative to your experiences and trying to mitigate downtime and really enabling productivity for all your staff that you support, how has cloud and hosted services come into the mix for relative to that? So Robert, can you start us off by chance?
Sure. I mean, for us, that was our conscious effort. I mean, the quote Joel just said, I mean, it hits it right in the head. Is I wanted to trust good partners, good vendors to manage that for us. So it really becomes the connectivity to those clouds. I mean, we're right now moving from a current private cloud provider to Mytech's private cloud environment. And hopefully by end of 2 days, we can call that a done project. And it really becomes looking at the connectivity to that environment. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got multiple internet lines coming in and out of our building. Now they're in the same trench in the street, so if the old backhoe scenario happens, I'm out of luck. But it's usually, if there's an outage in the internet or the network, it's usually a card somewhere in Chicago or someplace that really it's not as sexy as the backhoe scenario. So we focus on having those, multiple paths in and out of our building, and then just relying on, having good vendor management and relying on those vendors to help us manage it, talk through what if scenarios on getting access to, to that environment. Is it an MPLS line to the private cloud? Is it a VPN? Is it both? And having some of those discussions. But it's for us, it makes our disaster recovery testing real simple with our different business units. We do annual tabletop business impact analysis meetings and business continuity meetings, and it's really a tabletop discussion of, okay, accounting department, what happens if this building, isn't here tomorrow, or we get 2 foot of snow and you can't come to work? How are you going to function? And with having everything in the cloud, including our voice, they can, and we're Office 365 for our email, they can get to everything they need to from home. If they're a laptop user, it's all on their laptop. If they're working from home, they've got different ways to get in, but they can do everything. So our disaster recovery and business continuity really becomes a smooth, simple discussion on that end.
So if I heard like part of the plan, and I really appreciate that you have those tabletop discussions, because Joe mentioned earlier, like work through those contingencies, right? So part of it is you've built in redundancy at your physical office, so hopefully to increase the probability of mitigating like outages that happen on internet connections, because that happens.
Yeah.
But in addition to your cloud strategy, you've been intentional about a remote access method, so that if people can't get to the office or the office is gone or whatever happens, that you can still function.
Yep, exactly.
Any other key redundancies that you can think of that were part of your strategy in building out that plan?
Well, we've already kind of touched on some of the others. It's just the redundancy of the people you talked about. Is I don't have to worry about having a systems admin and then worry about that person taking a different job, and so it's instead let's hire in this case Mytech to manage our servers, and I know you've got more than one system admin on staff, so I'm not as worried about somebody getting promoted and moving on, because you've got the others, more bandwidth of staff to do that. And that's part of our review I have with Chris, our sales guy, our sales executive, is, what's the staffing look like? And this guy's the guy who used to always come to our office, and I hear he's leaving, and there's always a plan, and that's part of just, vendor management with that. So for me, it's the people continuity is as big as some of the other areas.
Oh, that's great. So thank you for sharing that. So Joe, how has, I'm not familiar with how Intrex has approached cloud and hosting services relative to mitigating outages or recoverability, those kind of things. Can you share what your strategy is or how you're engaging in that regard?
Yeah, it's pretty small at this point. We have some compliance regulations that we have to follow, and unfortunately, the industry is getting there, but not quite fully there. We are a defense supplier, so some of our information, it's not classified, but it is definitely controlled information. So we've been kind of looking at different solutions. The only things that we've really implemented at this point that I would consider this kind of cloud mitigation would be offsetting our backups from the Mytech solution to their data center, knowing that we do, even if the building burned down, we still have good quality backups out there. We are currently looking at a secondary internet line. Internet hasn't been a primary business application for us aside from email, but we have some things coming down right now. It's going to make it primary. So we're looking at a 4G LTE secondary connection, and to kind of be a backup for our fiber line. Excuse me. Yeah, not too much at this point.
Okay. Well, and so I can understand in your industry, that is definitely something for those listening, that the industry that you're in and the compliance requirements and some of the controls sometimes will predicate you not being able to move to a hosted environment, or being very what's the word I'm looking for? Very specific, or very reduce your options in that regard.
Right.
So good feedback. That's one thing that I love, you just even bringing that up, because these just O365 or a hosted environment is not always the best fit, depending on either A, the systems you have and the software you use, or B, business requirements and compliance, right? There's things that you have to address very uniquely to your own specific requirements. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
On the Office 365, just mention that I was just read something within the last couple of months that Office 365 is just getting to the point where we could actually use it. So they do have a plan for government and suppliers. So it's getting there. It's just not fully there yet. So.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that's one of the things that that's a whole nother conversation about security and compliance in O365, and the O365 has a team probably bigger than all of our organizations combined, that all they do is work on security and compliance, right? So there's some advantages to doing that, as long as they can check the boxes of your specific compliance requirements, right? So that's great. So Joel, can you what have you? I know that you're not in the position where you're implementing, not in the IT or business, investment role, but you're advising and you have some experience in sharing stories. Do you have anything to share or relative to the cloud and mitigating some of these risks?
Yeah, I do actually, and this is more a story about a client who didn't utilize the options that were available to them. So we're in Minnesota, and here we don't have hurricanes and things like that, and so people have a tendency to say things. I think it was Joe who said, if the building burned down, and most of us thinking about our businesses aren't worried about the building burning down, and because most of us don't have to worry about that. But what people don't realize sometimes is the impact that even something smaller can have. And this client of mine was they're a manufacturing company, and so they had a small fire in one of their machines. So, I mean, any fire is a big deal, but we're not talking about the building burning down. We're talking about a machine caught on fire. And that's not a huge thing, but how it ended up getting huge is that tons and tons of smoke billowed out of this machine and got into the HVAC system and got into the server room, and all of their stuff was on premise, so it was all local. And if you know anything about IT equipment, having it all covered in soot, isn't the best thing for it. And so the fire department came and they shut down the power to the building and all those kinds of things. And as soon as it was safe to go back in, they take a look and they saw that everything's covered in soot and you can't turn the stuff on like that. So they called their insurance company and said, hey, this is what happened, help us out. And the insurance company said, no problem, we got your back. Pack up all of your IT equipment, send it to us in the mail, and we have somebody who will clean it all and send it back to you in the mail. And they're like, whoa, like, okay, they're thinking this is going to be, a couple days problem kind of deal. Oh no, the insurance company said 2, maybe 3 weeks. Okay, well, you can't be down for 2 or 3 weeks while you ship your equipment somewhere to have it cleaned. And so were they in the cloud in terms of their applications and their email and things like that? A fire is always a big deal, but the recovering from it would have been phenomenally easier as opposed to fighting with an insurance company about what are you going to cover and how are we going to get back up. And part of it here too, so this isn't just about cloud versus non-cloud. This is also about what are the business requirements that you're up against, and what's your business going to do when stuff happens, because inevitably stuff will happen. And that's where, and Nate, you can buy me a beer later for saying this, but what happens with whoever's taking care of your technology needs to be somebody who can have high-level CIO type discussions, where their big problem here, this client of mine, wasn't about the technology. They didn't just need somebody who could, slam a trunk and fix a computer. They needed somebody that could be business advisors and know things like, well, if this happens, what's your insurance actually going to cover? And what's the process for this kind of thing? And so companies like Mytech that are big enough so that they don't just have a couple guys working out of a trunk, but have CIO level people on staff, can have those kinds of discussions that really need to be had. So it's about keeping your business alive, not just about keeping your technology up.
Thank you, Joel, and I will buy you a beer or a scotch or whatever for that. But the other thing I think you mentioned that was really impactful. In fact, I almost brought an insurance person. I was almost seeking an insurance person to join this panel, because I feel like that's one of the pieces that is a sometimes overlooked component of thinking through your entire ecosystem of recoverability or continuity. And even to the point of sometimes it's not an insurance thing, but relative to what you just mentioned about 2 to 3 weeks to clean equipment or whatever, sometimes if you don't look at the details of what the warranty is you're buying for some of the equipment you have, it's a depot warranty, which means you have to send your equipment off site to get fixed. And again, it typically in most businesses, sending your equipment away doesn't really work. So it's really taking a look at those different variables and understanding how is that going to get executed on if and when you have to use it. Hopefully, again, the thing about disaster recovery and continuity is you hope you never have to use it, right? We go out these mental exercises and these contingencies, kind of like Joe and Robert, you even said the table conversations on an annual basis, like trying to figure out, well, what if scenarios. You hope you never have to use those things, but you definitely don't want to be in that situation and not have ever thought about them to begin with. So I think that was really the biggest point of this conversation today. And gentlemen, you did an excellent job of just kind of sharing how you think through things and sharing some stories that hopefully none of us ever have to live through again. But thank you for taking the time out of your day to share and just some of these contingencies and how to think through these scenarios, because you can put the very common, sometimes inexpensive things in place to help mitigate against these common risks. Like in Joe's example, an extra network card would have prevented hours and hours of downtime and however much money that would have lost. And then insurance and evaluating that as well. So we're at our time, but I do want to mention a couple things really quick for everyone listening and for the future. We have, so our quarterly theme this quarter is around disaster recovery and business continuity and redundancy. Like, what are the kind of things you can do? So next month, we're actually basically talking about all of these little things that are best practices that we recommend to our clients that enable productivity, because productivity is built on system availability and uptime. So that's what our next month's Mytech U discussion is on, around these common best practices that you can implement in your organization and put into your plan over time. And then in January, we have 2 events in our Minnesota and Colorado offices where if you have been paying attention to Office 365 at all, there's a lot of new productivity and collaboration and communication tools that have been released. And we're actually doing a session on those and hopefully educating folks on these are some tools that are available to you today that actually do a great job of helping increase communication and collaboration with the team. So we want you to be aware of that as well. So please register for that at mytech.com/events. With that said, gentlemen, Joe, Robert, Joel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll sign off.
Yeah, thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.